Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar on using Agency Safety Plan, or ASP reviews and updates to advance your safety management system, or SMS. I'm Stuart Mader, and I lead the Public Transportation Agency Safety Plans, or PTASP, Technical Assistance Center within FTA's Office of Transit Safety and Oversight. We're also joined today by Andrew Lofton, a contractor supporting the PTASP Technical Assistance Center, as well as two industry speakers who will share their perspective with you as well. Throughout the webinar, we invite you to type your questions into the Q&A box, and FTA will review those questions and will pose those questions and provide answers at the end of today's presentation. So please, as you think of questions, share them in the Q&A box. The earlier, the better. That gives us a chance to look at them and get ready to answer them during Q&A. The slides for today's webinar and a recording will be available on the PTASP TAC resource library website within a couple of days after the completion of today's webinar. Our objectives today are to help you identify PTASP requirements for ASP reviews and updates, and to describe some methods that transit agencies can use to reflect and push forward the maturity of their SMS in your ASP. And I'll now turn it over to Andy to go over today's agenda. Andy?
Thanks so much, Stuart, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. During our webinar today, number one, we're going to provide an overview of the existing PTASP regulation requirements for ASP updates. Number two, the good part of today's webinar, we're going to hear from two industry speakers to talk about their experience at their transit agencies with the ASP review and update process. And then finally, we're going to end our session with a Q&A period. And as we've done with the last webinars in this series, is that we've encouraged our participants to ask questions directly to our industry speakers. So we're all going to get a chance today to hear from both of our speakers, and throughout their presentations, if you have anything you'd like to ask them, as Stuart said, put it right into the Q&A pod. And we've got a team of people that are going to queue those up, so we'll be able to ask our speakers during this Q&A session. Also, importantly, we do need to remind everyone that during the webinar today, we're really limiting our discussion to the current PTASP regulatory requirements. And that means we're not going to discuss content in the recent Notice of Proposed Rulemaking for the PTASP regulation. So today's webinar limited to current PTASP regulation only. And as I mentioned in today's webinar, we're going to talk to Alexander Hauck from the Maryland Transit Administration. He's the Deputy Chief Safety Officer there. And we're also going to get a chance to hear from Mike Smith, who's the Chief Safety Officer at the New Orleans Regional Transit Authority. Now, before we get into our content, we always like to remind our participants that the Federal Transit Administration publishes a literal library of resources on the PTASP regulation and the associated content, including safety management systems. So on this library, within the library, you can find resources that are related to all aspects of SMS, including your agency safety plan updates. So we encourage everyone, when you get a chance, to visit the PTASP TAC resource library, which you can find at www.transit.dot.gov/PTASP-TAC. Find a lot of great information on that website. Now, with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Stuart to talk about our feedback process. Stuart?
Thanks, Andy. We want to take a moment to thank everybody who continues to complete our feedback surveys that we post after each webinar. This feedback continues to help us develop and deliver these resources, the webinars and our other technical assistance resources available in the TAC library, and to make sure they're most relevant to your needs. And as you see, we're continuing to evolve the webinar format. You're going to hear from two industry speakers today, and we're really excited to hear their insight and perspective throughout the webinar, and then we'll have a Q&A session. And we've also shortened the length of today's webinar. We've recently shortened the webinar length to about an hour, and we're finding that is working well in terms of the balance between providing a good amount of information and being respectful of your time and schedules. And with that, let's talk about PTASP requirements for ASP updates as required under the PTASP regulation. Part 673.11A5 requires applicable transit agencies to establish a process and timeline for conducting an annual review and update of your ASP. Remember that transit agencies that operate a rail-fixed guideway system, they also have additional requirements for their ASP updates that are established by their State Safety Oversight Agency, or SSOA. And as we hope most of you will recall, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law requires transit agencies that receive Section 5307 funding and serve a large urbanized area, that's an urbanized area with a population of 200,000 or more, to establish a joint labor management safety committee. And this certainly impacts the ASP update process for those agencies required to have a safety committee. So let's take a step back and talk about the ASP update process for agencies first that are not required to have a safety committee. At those transit agencies, once the agency updates its ASP, the accountable executive must sign the ASP, acknowledge that they are ultimately responsible for implementation of SMS and safety performance, and then the board of directors or equivalent authority of that agency must approve the ASP. Now, for transit agencies that are required to have a safety committee, there's an additional step in the process. Once the agency completes the work to update its ASP, the annual update, the safety committee must approve the ASP, and that needs to happen before the accountable executive signs it and before the board of directors or equivalent authority approves the ASP. So regardless of whether your agency is required to have a safety committee, if your agency operates a rail-fixed guideway public transportation system, remember you may also have additional requirements that come from your SSOA. And in addition, after your board of directors approves your ASP needs to go to your SSOA for review and approval. So now that we've reviewed the requirements for ASP updates, let's briefly go over some considerations for the review and update process. And Andy, I'll turn it over to you for that.
Thank you so much, Stuart. So to get us thinking a little bit about the agency safety plan update process, and also to prepare us for the content we're going to hear from our industry speakers, let's think about some reasons that your agency might actually update your agency safety plan. Now, first of all, you might update your ASP in response to changes within your agency, within the organizational structure of your agency, or within the system or operating characteristics of your transit agency. Number two, you might also update your ASP because you've made changes to the policies or the procedures that affect your safety management system, or that affect safety in general at your agency and that are relevant to your ASP or that are discussed in your ASP. Your agency may sometimes update its ASP in order to comply with new or changed FTA regulations. And as Stuart just mentioned, if your agency falls under the jurisdiction of a state safety oversight agency, you may also update your ASP to comply with requirements of the SSOA's program standard or other oversight action. Agencies may update their ASP to reflect new safety objectives defined by the agency, and to update safety performance targets that are set to help the agency ensure it meets those objectives. Sometimes a transit agency may update its ASP to reflect changes in its employee safety reporting program, and to make sure that those changes are documented in the agency safety plan. Agencies may need to update their ASP because they have new safety promotion initiatives or new training processes that need to be reflected in the agency safety plan. And in general, your agency may update its ASP to reflect really any update or any changes to the safety programs that are described within your agency safety plan. So the purpose of thinking about these topics right now is just to help us put into our minds why we update our ASP and how those changes reflect real changes at our transit agency. And at this time, we're going to turn the microphone over to our industry participants so that they can help us really dig into this topic a little bit deeper. And we are very fortunate to hear from our first guest, who is Mike Smith, the Chief Safety Officer with the New Orleans Regional Transit Authority. We're happy to have Mike today. He brings with him more than 20 years of experience in transit safety, operations, regulatory compliance, and project management. Prior to joining RTA, Mike served as a contractor to the Federal Transit Administration's Office of Transit Safety and Oversight. And in that role, he was responsible for helping develop regulations, standards, technical assistance, tools, and training for the transit industry. Mike has also held operations and safety positions at several transit properties, including the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority in Washington, D.C. Mike, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Andy. And thank you, FTA, for the opportunity to speak today and share a little bit about our perspective in New Orleans. The theme that I'd like to convey to the audience is the ASP review. While it does meet regulatory requirements, and it is required as was presented earlier, it's more than a checking the box exercise. And in fact, the very act of updating the ASP and ensuring that it does accurately reflect your SMS as it currently stands is in and of itself an effective tool for growing your SMS. So with that, next slide, please. And just a brief overview for those who may not be familiar or maybe less familiar with the New Orleans Regional Transit Authority. We are unique in many ways. We are a smaller, mid-size transit agency, given the size of the metropolitan area that we serve. However, because we operate a rail mode in our heritage streetcar mode, and there you see on the slide, we actually have 5 streetcar lines and about 39 track miles throughout our system. Because of that, we're held to some additional requirements that some of our peer agencies may not necessarily have to abide by. So we have a ridership pre-COVID of just shy of 20 million annually. We have a team of approximately 900 staff dedicated to delivering transit service in the city limits as well as the surrounding parishes. And just of note, just one interesting tidbit here, you may or may not know this, our St. Charles line, one of those 5 streetcar lines, has the distinction of being the oldest continuously operating street railway, not just in the US, but in the world, dating back to 1835. And in fact, the Pearly Thomas streetcars, a portion of our streetcar fleet, we actually have to this day some rolling stock that is 100 years old, effective next month, and we're going to be commemorating that 100-year anniversary with a small party at our Carrollton streetcar barn. Next slide. But for today, with the time I have with you, I'd like to just talk about how we abide by FTA's requirements for reviewing and updating our agency safety plan and how that's tied to our overall SMS implementation effort. So here you see a graphic of the process we follow, and perhaps it's very similar to what the listeners follow at their agencies. We kick it off in safety with a track changes version there at the top of the cycle. And it's timely because actually that's where we are today for the what will be the 2024 version of our agency safety plan. My staff is currently reviewing that document now. After we feel that it incorporates the previous year's SMS activities and is informed by all the sources of required changes that Andy had up on the slide earlier, we kick it over to our executive leadership team for review. And then as a relatively new step out of the bipartisan infrastructure law requirements concerning safety committees and their involvement, we kick it over to our labor management safety committee as required, where we hold a simple majority vote for approval. In our case, we also concurrently send it to what we call the SMS steering committee and get their vote of approval at the same time. We incorporate all necessary feedback and then send it over to our Board of Commissioners, as is also required. And then the key here after that, and what I'd like to spend the majority of my time talking about, is we implement that safety plan and use it to drive our overall SMS growth throughout the system. All of this is now in accordance with a new SOP that my team developed called the ASP revision SOP, which we recently revised, accounting for those new FTA requirements. Next slide. And advance again. There we go. So there we have, in that SOP, it breaks down the different types of updates that we would conceivably have to do with our plan, be it scheduled or unscheduled. And that was already covered earlier, so we can go to the next slide. One thing of note in our case, in 2020, shortly after I took over this role, we took all of our positions in-house. So those 894 positions, the vast majority of them previously, for many years, over a decade, had been managed and owned by an operating contractor, operations and maintenance contractor. In December of 2020, we brought those positions in-house. And when we did that, one of the downwind implications of that my peers didn't necessarily see on their radar, but me, knowing FTA's requirements for management of change and safety assurance, I knew we had to take up, was to go ahead and issue what I called an unscheduled revision of our safety plan. So that's what we did. And we actually, because of that, following the passage of the PTASP final rule 673, we had to date 4 versions of our safety plan since December of 2020, and we're going through the revision process now for our 5th version. Here you see different things that need to be incorporated into your update. Next slide. So just a moment more on this to elaborate. So in that cycle, I intentionally include SMS implementation as one of these steps. And it's important to remember that the SMS, and in particular your safety assurance activities, in my view, along with all the other things that need to be incorporated into the update, those are really what we have found at RTA to be our primary focus when looking at the next year's safety plan. So what do I mean by that? For us, safety assurance includes our management of change, and I gave an example of that from the 2020 transition to in-house staffing, but also internal safety management audits, rules and SOP reviews, continuous improvement. And a lot of this, by the way, is governed by our SMS steering committee, which I mentioned earlier. So the folks in that committee are intimately involved in all of these safety assurance activities, and they help me as Chief Safety Officer ensure that those updates are accounted for in the plan itself, so that it's a proper snapshot of what our SMS is looking like. Next slide. Specific to internal safety management audits, which are one of those safety assurance mechanisms, if you will, I wanted to speak for a moment about a methodology shift that we found to be helpful here. Previously, dating back to Part 659 days with the System Safety Program Plan rule, and as probably many in the audience are accustomed to, the internal safety reviews or audits are typically focused on departments or functions within the agency, and we were no different. That's how we structured our internal safety audits. When we transitioned to SMS and now the Agency Safety Plan rule under 673, we have shifted our methodology into being SMS component based. And in fact, this fall, we'll be undertaking our audit over the first of the 4 components, safety management policy. And in some ways, it's very similar to what we were doing before, but we're finding that when we made this shift, we're getting more buy-in from our department stakeholders. Instead of it being a compliance exercise or a check the box exercise, which we certainly want to avoid, it becomes more collaborative just by virtue of it being about SMS. It serves as an additional checkpoint between my team and those department partners to ensure that we're all speaking the same language still. We're all committed to those safety performance targets and our safety management goals and objectives, and just in general that the SMS is performing as intended. Next slide. And so I won't read through every one of these, and if you download the PowerPoint or view this presentation later, you can feel free to read through these. But why shift to that SMS component-based audit? Here are some of several reasons why we felt that was a good idea, and happy to report that so far that's going well. Next slide. And I'm running short on time, but just wanted to illustrate this in another way, that important connection between the safety plan and your overall SMS. So if you view these 4 SMS components, and the squares represent the scope of what we need to do in order to build a mature SMS that's fully compliant with FTA. Go ahead and advance, Andy. The way we think that it's helpful to view it is that progress is iterative in nature, and you're covering certain aspects of the scope in each, but you're not going to cover it all in one swoop. And therefore underscores the importance of having that ASP be an accurate snapshot of where you are relative to that implementation, but also not being so stringent or strict with it that in an audit environment or in any other engagement with departments, you're holding people to a certain level of performance. Instead, we find it more productive, more meaningful for everyone if we have a collaborative discussion about how the progress is going. And then as we do that, we had to elevate the importance of another standalone document, which we call our SMS implementation plan, which is also updated annually. Here you see a quick snapshot of it. But in other words, recognizing that when you do the review and update of your ASP, it is merely a snapshot in time. It's where you stand currently. In order to get into the meat of what we're doing to develop and implement the SMS throughout the agency, you need to have a little more detail. And so for us, we actually attach that as an appendix to our ASP. In addition to it being an appendix, we review it regularly with staff. We discuss it in our quarterly SMS steering committee meeting, and we provide a quarterly briefing up to the state safety oversight, who are, by the way, integral partners in monitoring our SMS progress, and their partnership is really valuable in terms of understanding that methodology shift, that it is supposed to be performance driven, not necessarily compliance focused. Next slide. And that's all I have today. I'll yield to my colleague, Alexander. There you see my contact info, and I'll be sticking around for questions during this presentation. Thank you for the time.
Mike, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Great presentation. Now, and also, Mike, don't go far, because I'm sure we're going to need to hear from you in our Q&A session coming up at the end. But next, we want to introduce our second speaker, Mr. Alexander Hauck. Alexander is a transit industry professional with 16 years of experience, dating back to his days as a student bus driver at the University of Virginia. He manages his agency's SMS implementation at the Maryland Transit Administration, or MTA, and he currently serves as the chairperson for the agency's Joint Safety Committee. Alexander, welcome.
Thank you so much, Andy. I appreciate the time today, and I appreciate the words my colleague, Mike Smith, put there. Mr. Smith and I go back quite a ways, about 15 years, and I knew he was going to be thorough in covering a lot of those aspects of SMS and the updates. So my presentation will hopefully be a little bit shorter and kind of be a little bit more 30,000-foot view in terms of some of the aspects of, that driving that SMS implementation through ASP reviews. So you can go ahead and advance the slide. This will be available, of course, for anybody who wants to download it. But for a big part of what we want to do with M.MTA, not to be confused, with New York, is we're a top 15 multimodal transit agency. I think the only type of transit we don't provide is a funicular. And so we have bus, mobility, metro, light rail, and our MARC commuter train, which is not susceptible to PTASP updates. That is under the SSPP. And we want to have conversations about PTASP in terms of it being the keyword plan. And plans are all about intent. It documents what you're supposed to do and also what you plan on doing. We just kicked off our period of review for our annual update to our PTASP right now. And one of the things we have to keep in mind is that while a lot of your ASP is concrete, some of that concrete is still curing. You're going to leave placeholders for processes that are being developed. And it's important to stay on track and follow through on those. One of the things when I took over as the task manager for the PTASP update at MTA was that we had a section that had to do with safety assurance, one of our 4 components, about ensuring that caps, corrective actions, and mitigations were being implemented correctly. And that was kind of a promise we had made as our SMS was maturing. And one of the things that we set up with our contracted support was developing something that we call MMAP, which is the Mitigation Monitoring Assurance Plan. That's why we speak in acronyms in this industry, right? The idea being that we would set up, based on hierarchy of controls, a way to go back and assess how these implemented mitigations were working. So that's one thing to keep in mind. That plan is there for who's going to come after you as well. We're all just stewards of any job that we hold, including, ASP reviews as a task under a position you might hold. And the person who's reviewing your PTASP is going to change on a long enough timeline, whether it's a person who's there for 2 or 3 years or somebody who's there for 20 or 30. The other thing you're going to want to do really is, and Mike mentioned this as well, is turn those non-modal departments into allies. Identify who the key stakeholders are within your agency who are going to be either signatories or have a role in updating your ASP. It's important to know those people personally, to have one-on-one conversations, and to make sure they're part of the process. Because when we talk about SMS as being driven from the top down, your folks who are outside of your modal operations, whether it's IT, HR, comms, and marketing, those division leaders, department heads, they're going to be the ones who you need on your side to make this happen. For us, we had our recent SSO triennial, and there were 4 departments, audits, HR, IT, and performance management, as we call it, that we have now had an opportunity to have one-on-one conversations related to identifying clear roles and responsibilities, updating SOPs, and ensuring that they have a very carved out area within the PTASP that they're responsible for and understand. We even identified another PTASP signatory as a result, so somebody who will be part of that annual review. And this idea that I have on the slide here about gift to get, it's really not so much, tit for tat or quid pro quo. It's really this idea that building a relationship with these other stakeholders is based primarily on asking people to do more work and to divert attention from their day-to-day operational priorities. And you're really asking them to satisfy your department's needs. And if you're in safety like I am, that's primarily asking them to help with caps, if we're being honest. So that always begs the question from these people, what's in it for me? What are they going to be getting by helping you? And not just the general sense of it's something that we have to do as an agency. So our safety department recently absorbed our training department to better align with industry standards. At our current PTASP revision kickoff that we had last week, I ensured that our director of training was a formal invitee. In other words, it wasn't just that they were added later or that they weren't part of the process. We wanted to make sure that this person could ask questions and offer input at that kickoff meeting, and then decide how much they wanted to be involved with the process going forward. Obviously, they're going to have responsibilities in terms of revision and that sort of thing, but I was putting myself in a position where I'm going to need this person to do something for me later, and I wanted to have them involved from the get-go. But they get to decide how much they're going to be involved. It's kind of like being invited to a party. You don't necessarily have to go, but the invitation is nice. And when we're asking departments to really incorporate safety as a business practice, it may seem like a passive exercise for a group like comms and marketing, like I mentioned, and it's about finding ways to gift to get. So our comms and marketing, they want to be able to get better pictures, better photos of trains for promotions like Operation Lifesaver Rail Safety Week that we all just went through last week if you're an RTA. That's great, but of course they need rail worker protection training. They need that RWP. And so that gives safety as a facilitator the opportunity to gift that RWP training so we can get our comms and marketing participation and other SMS opportunities that we might need going forward for implementation. Things like needing implements designed for our fatigue risk management program they're working on, needing a video to promote the job function of our OCC that highlights hazards in the workplace, just to name a couple of examples. We can go and advance the slide. And, when I mentioned top-down driving SMS, your accountable executive is busy. As the slide says, that for us at MTA, that's our administrator. We also have a chief safety officer who's in charge of our safety department, and they both have plates that are just piled with issues that demand their attention daily. Of course, they're fully apprised of issues that require their attention when it comes to safety, our priority 1 and 2 risks. But no matter how well-known, popular, likable your AE is, no one person in any organization can earn buy-in from every person at your agency. So it's important that your supervisors and their direct reports, they need to have a healthy functioning relationship to satisfy that what's in it for me mentality. If SMS is trickled down, then the folks doing the real work of a transit agency, your operators, your maintenance staff, even the people who take care of, custodial work, they're going to get pretty thirsty, especially when there's a lot more of them. So as an analogy, maybe a better way to look at it is, how do you get your water? Right? That's something that we all use every day. Most people who live in the suburbs, you're used to consistent, reliable water pressure thanks to water towers, and those hold about 1 million gallons of water. Those towers use, and I'm going to get a little technical here, so stick with me. They use gravity-driven hydrostatic pressure that forces water at speed through the system, and that works in conjunction with your water treatment plant to supply water. So without a water tower, there wouldn't be enough pressure to send water through distribution pipes at a fast enough rate. The towers work even without electricity because they're gravity fed, so they can do that for a while. But if you're tracking what I'm getting at, your accountable executive, they're the water tower. They're the person who can put pressure on a lot of folks to get things done, and they have a lot of power. And you can kind of do a micro version of that at every level of your organization, whether it's a superintendent, a director. You're going to have somebody who can put pressure for a while, but they need everything to be driven by the people who are going to make the change happen. Getting that buy-in that we always talk about. And your ASP update is going to probably be one of the few times in a year where you have more of your accountable executives' attention. And that's when you get to be an advocate for changes that are needed and get that support, since the focus will be on this period of review. And your accountable executive or your board or equivalent authority, they need to know what they're signing off in a document that gets a lot of scrutiny, and of course is going to be subject to audits throughout the year. In an agency with a good safety culture, it's really the power of others getting most of the work done and maybe just needing a little boost from your accountable executive. So keep that in mind when you think about things like burnout, key vacancies, vacations, and all sorts of variables that are going to affect your available energy, right? When everyone at your agency, no matter where they sit on your org chart, can reliably access info like job safety analyses, safety data sheets, if they can check up on a safety hazard that they reported through your ESRP and have faith that the organization is truly supporting them to correct these issues and reduce risk, they're going to be a lot happier with the process. You're going to have that buy-in because you're going to trust that's happening. And don't forget to take the pulse. Just like the utility company may send out a satisfaction survey, use your agency safety culture survey, if you have one or whatever you call it, or develop one to see what people think of the agency's tactics. The weakness that you identify should clue you into which part of your ASP might need updating. Is it competencies and training? Is it risk reporting for risk management processes? Is it mitigation monitoring and success as part of safety assurance? How many people are even aware at your agency of your safety management policy statement and what it says? That's a question that we're actually asking in our safety culture survey that's going to be going out in the next couple of weeks. that's pretty much all I have today. I know we're running short on time, so I just want to say thank you to everybody on behalf of the Maryland Transit Administration for your time today, and good luck on your own annual PTASP updates.
Thanks to Alexander and Mike. Both of those presentations were excellent. And with that, we thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everyone.